lying in wait could come out and ambush him. But as so often happened, the constable was impressed by Joseph, actually came to like him, and was impressed that he was not at all what he had been told. So instead of slowing the wagon down as they came around that bend, he whipped the horses into a faster pace, and they were making good time as they ran away from the mob, who were now saddling up and trying to come in hot pursuit. The wagon loses a wheel just at this moment, though. I'm not making this up. So Joseph is propping up the wagon while the constable's putting the wheel back on, and here comes the mob riding as fast as they can. They get back in the wagon. These must have been really good horses, because they outrace the mob and they get to the inn where the court will be held the next day. Back in those days, they didn't have really formal courthouses for the most part. They were held in justice of the peace parlors, or in, if it needed a larger place, then in a tavern or an inn, and that's where they went this time. I mentioned that this constable was quite courageous because he not only ran away from the mob, but he told Joseph, now there's only one bed in this room, you take the bed, I'll lie here on the floor with my musket beside me, and I'll prop my feet against the door so they can't get in, and you can try to get a good night's sleep. The court started the next morning at 10 a.m. This is about midnight now, okay? You haven't prepared your case. You hardly know what the case is. But Joseph Knight, well, Joseph Smith so often relied on others to finance these defenses and to bring these lawsuits. So two farmer friends of the Knight family, John Reed and James Davidson, who also happened to be lawyers, were impressed into duty. So at 10 o'clock the next morning, the court begins. And again, 12 witnesses, similar charges to what he had before. It had nothing to do with treasure seeking this time. It was just general disorderly conduct, vagrancy statutes, lack of visible means of support. This went on till about midnight, and Justice Chamberlain uttered those words that they waited to hear, not guilty. Immediately as they walked out the front door of the courthouse, though, or the little tavern, John Reed, the attorney, said that they were seized by some fiends from hell, the next county over. So the case is not over. Now it's time to go to Colesville, Broome County. Well, this constable is not nearly as considerate as the last one. He actually chained himself to Joseph. He fed him bread and water, and that's all he had. And as they tried to rest, whenever Joseph would move, he would jerk him to make sure he wasn't trying to get away. Now this time, the charges are very similar, except they added to it casting out a devil as a version of disorderly conduct. And Newell Knight was the recipient of that benefit. And one of the questions that was put to Knight as they had this exchange was, well, Mr. Knight, is it true that the devil was cast out of you? And he said, well, that's correct. Well, then, did you see the devil? Yes, sir, I did. Well, would you please describe the devil to this court? He said, well, maybe I could first answer the question, ask you a question. There's objection, of course, and you don't need to answer the question. He says, I'll answer the question if you'll first answer my question. Do you believe in spiritual things that cannot be seen with a visible eye? And he said, well, of course not. I'm a lawyer. And so he said, well, then it would do no good to describe the devil to you, because it would only be discerned by those who can see things spiritually. So they changed the subject and went on with 40 other witnesses. Josiah Stoll came back and many others, and this went on for 18 hours. So it's now been a total of 40 hours in a period of 2 days. And again, the result this time from a 3-judge panel was not guilty. So this time the disgruntled participants decided that they needed to administer their own version of rough justice. So they're out front fashioning something to apply their own version to Joseph, and the two lawyers, and by now the repentant constable and the judge, hatch a plan. So what they'll do, one lawyer will go out front with the constable and detain the mob, while the other lawyer and the judge will go to the back room, open the window, and let Joseph and Oliver out through the woods. And so they run the rest of the night, arriving home the remaining 15 miles, totally exhausted and ready to get out of New York, I guess. Although Joseph was exonerated in both trials, malicious rumors came to Emma's parents, and they invited them to leave. They basically disowned Emma and Joseph, and she never saw her parents again. So here is where all of this happened. Harmony is the lower dot, and then just across the border is South Bainbridge, and Colesville is right next to it. Palmyra is upstate, as you know. And I didn't mean to hit that one quite yet. So it's now time to start the westward movement. On New Year's Day of 1831, the Lord told Joseph it's time to go to the Ohio, and there he will endow him with power and reveal the law of the Lord. So now we're in Ohio, and how did things go there? During the 7 years that Joseph and most of the saints lived in Ohio, things went very well. The lawsuits that they brought and defended were done very successfully, but there were more suits there than anywhere during Joseph's life, a total of 66 if you count all the suits against the Kirtland Temple Committee. And these are just a few examples, ranging from performing marriages without a license to having to evict an armed mob from the temple. They were charged with riot and assault. This is Joseph Sr. and some of the other family members, and they were acquitted by a justice of the peace named Oliver Cowdery, which was helpful. The next week there was an arson of the printing press and the book bindery next door, and so some mob was brought, and not all cases were brought successfully. They did not have sufficient evidence to convict those 5 men. The most serious case, though, business disaster of Joseph's life, involved another oxymoron, the Kirtland Safety Society. This is a copy of the banknote that I have in my possession, March 9th, 1837. Now this resulted from very difficult times on the western frontier. Credit was tight. Many banks were being formed that could issue their own banknotes so that there was more currency. And like the others, the saints got their own bank and got their press and started printing their notes. But unlike the others, they did not get a license. It was denied to them at the very last minute. So they just stamped anti-banking safety society, and that was not quite sufficient. A private suit was brought against them for banking without a license. And before I get to this, I need to tell you about while they were waiting for the case to be heard, on the 27th of July, 6 suits were brought the same day against Joseph, and 4 of the 6 were actually heard that same day. Here's how he described the last thing that happened during the day. As they were leaving town, having disposed of 5 of these, he said, "At sunset, I got into my son's carriage to return home. At this moment, the sheriff sprang into our carriage, seized my lines, and served another writ on me, sworn out by a man who just a few weeks previous had brought a new-fashioned cooking stove to Kirtland and wished me to test it for him. That man thought that now would be a good time to get paid for it. I had to give my watch up to the officer for security, and then we all returned home." And as far as we know, he did not go through Paynesville again. He found a way to circumvent Paynesville, having endured that much harassment. Now, the next October is when this Safety Society case was heard. It was apparently resolved against Joseph and some of the other officers, but they appealed the case, and while it was still pending, they moved from Ohio to Missouri. It finally ended up in a judgment, a default judgment, against the assets of the church that remained at that time, and through various sequence of things, that included the Kirtland Temple, and some 25 years later, through this suit, it actually passed hands to the present owners in possession of the temple. Often a charge that's made against Joseph and the saints that the reason they flew out of Kirtland the way they did was to avoid their debts, and it's true that they were huge. $52,000 back then that was owed was a huge amount. But Gordon Madsen and Jeff Walker, who work on our team, have determined that over 90% of that was paid, much of it long after they'd left Ohio and their beloved temple. So now it's on to Missouri, and you can see that this is a sweep across 6 states. How did things go in Missouri? Well, not very well. We call it mob rule. They called it people in action, popular sovereignty. The Mormons were very unpopular for a lot of reasons in Missouri. They were considered religious fanatics. They were taking the place over, coming in very large numbers. They felt threatened in every possible way. But the last straw was probably the fact that they were Northerners in a slave state. And in July of 1833, the publisher of the Morning and Evening Star published an issue describing the requirements for bringing freed slaves into Missouri. And the Missourians did not take kindly to that. This is an affront to their culture. It was certainly not illegal to bring freed slaves here, but they did not take well to that. And so they took some matters into their own hands and decided that they would do this to the press.